Dr. Gerald Power interviews psychologist Nicky Hayes from Megabooks.
Okay, so Professor Nicky Hayes, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. I am a lay reader, so my questions will be the layest of lay questions, if that's okay.
That's perfect, because the book is designed for the lay reader.
Wonderful. Could I ask you first to talk a little bit about your career in psychology?
Well, my career's been fairly eclectic. I haven't followed the normal university postgraduate lecturing route. I've done quite a few other things, but I have been an academic for quite a long time. I'm retired now, of course, but when I first graduated, I worked for a while I studied psychology when I first graduated, and I thought, wow, this is brilliant, I really like this. And then I worked for a while in children's homes and residential social work, first with children, then with adolescents. And that really showed me how important psychology was for everyday life, for understanding basic things about everyday living. Because I would see things where even the tiniest bit of knowledge of psychology would have helped people. One of the examples is the example of, a member of staff at a children's home who would have a 6-year-old misbehaving at breakfast time and give them the punishment of early bed, which meant that 12 hours later, that 6-year-old would be brought in by another member of staff and had no recollection of what they'd done, really, and certainly was out. And I thought, well, even the tiniest bit of knowledge of psychology would have told them that something like that was no use unless it was immediate, and that, it was actually probably more damaging to the child to do what they were doing. So even a little bit of psychology would be helpful. And there were so many examples like that of ways that psychology could help us to understand each other better. And so after about 3.5 years, I went to, it was time I did another course. So I thought I would, I trained as a lecturer in colleges, tech colleges, and discovered then that people were starting up basic level, entry level psychology, not university level, but basic level. And I had a lot of students who were adults who had failed in school, but were coming to evening classes or daytime classes and studying psychology because it was a subject they hadn't failed at. And then when they were studying it, they found it was really interesting, and many of them went on to study it at university, and some got doctorates, and I can think of at least 3 of them who are now lecturers in their own right, or became so. But that was also very good for me in terms of recognizing the value of psychology in everyday living. But there were very few books available at basic level. So after my first couple of years of teaching, I thought, I need to write, my students need a textbook, and I wrote one and discovered I had a talent for it, really. I mean, it was rejected by over 50 publishers because they said, oh, there's no market for this, people aren't interested in psychology. But my friend who had typed it out for me, because we were working on typewriters in those days, and although I can type fast, I can't type accurately. And she said, no, this is a good book, keep going. So eventually I found a publisher who was ready to put a toe in the water, as it were. The book was published, and then after that, other people asked me to write books. Other publishers would ask me to write books. And school psychology at that level in the UK is now the second most popular subject, second only to English at advanced level in schools. So I think we were fairly successful in promoting psychology at that level. But it was really what helped me so much was the feedback from my students who were, as I say, mostly mature, coming to it from experience in their day-to-day lives, and taking the ideas and running with them, taking the ideas and showing how they were relevant, saying, oh yes, well, we did that. I went on to do quite a lot of lecturing in psychology and eventually did my PhD and got into academic research. But among other courses that I taught, one of the most interesting courses I taught was on an MBA, a professional MBA for management students, but it was a 1-year full-time MBA for students from across the world. And the people I had there were full-time managers who often mature and came from all over, Southeast Asia, Africa, all over. They'd been sort of sent by their companies to do the MBA, and that's why it was quite concentrated in 1 year. And I was teaching organizational behavior, which basically was psychology under another name. And I taught it mostly by, I'd explain a concept and they would look at how that applied in their own companies and their own experience. And they had so much experience of working in psychology, and that again was such an enriching process. So in a sense, I've been convinced for a long time how valuable psychology and understanding of psychology can be in just making sense of our own lives. And I've written a lot of books sort of along those lines. I've also written academic books, academic textbooks, and at least one co-wrote a monograph that's the sort of thing that only a very few specialists will ever read. But I enjoy communicating psychology. I think it has a lot to offer. But one of the advantages of writing books at this level is that it means I've kept up. I've kept up with the changes in the discipline over time. So when Yale University Press invited me to write a little history of psychology, I thought, yeah, I've been studying psychology, as it were. I mean, the great thing about writing books is you can study psychology, but you have no exams, so that's fantastic. Be a perpetual student. But I thought, well, great. I've lived through 50 years of it. And I've seen how it's changed from the start, and I really, really enjoyed writing the book. Because it gave me a chance to reflect on those 50 years, but also to look back on the history I've been taught and find out a bit more about it and bring in other aspects of experience. So there you are. There's a potted history of my life.
Thank you. Definitely the person to write this book, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned the little history series that this is part of by Yale, because it's such a legendary series. You must have been quite proud to get the commission.
I was so honoured. I mean, you don't approach them, they approach you. And I knew the little history series, obviously, and they have such a great brief, because they say to you, right, 40 chapters, 2,000 words per chapter. That's what they want with all of them. And that's great, because it means you can read it in bite-sized chunks. I was reading the little history of art and just doing a chapter each night. It's manageable, isn't it? It's easy to do that. So I really enjoyed writing to that brief, and I was very, very complimented when they asked me to write it. And they seemed to be reasonably happy about it afterwards. When I'd written it, they seemed to quite like it, most of it.
I'm sure they were. I've loved the book, and I have a couple of just little questions to bring out some of the decisions and ideas you had as you were putting it together. And one of them is about the biographical information that you put into the chapters, because almost every chapter has a little account of the individual psychologist who pioneered something. Does that come naturally to you as a writer and someone interested in psychology, or was it something that it occurred to you as you're writing the book that this would be a good feature to have in every chapter?
I think they gave me permission to do it. They said that they were quite happy to have anecdotes and my own opinions and things in there, which was great, because it meant I didn't have to write something that was terribly dry and formal. At the same time, I like writing like that, and I think people learn better. Or people enjoy reading anecdotes. They enjoy reading stories. It's nice. Some of them are not necessarily anecdotes about particular psychologists. Some of them are. I'm thinking of one particular thing, which is like a conversation between two students who were participating in a famous experiment, and it saved me from writing about the experiment in tedious detail, because it was all there in their conversation, and that was just a much easier way of. Well, it probably wasn't easy. I remember having to think about it a bit, to do it, but it was a much more effective way of communicating that. It meant that the reader can grasp it quickly, and I can explain it accurately without having to go into an enormous number of words.
Yeah, no, it definitely works really, really effectively. I can testify. I knew before reading the book about the different schools and approaches to psychology. I knew a little bit about some of them, but not a lot of detail. But one thing the book did was it told me how many different branches there are to psychology, and how sometimes it can be quite almost tribal.
It
different
has
approaches.
Been in the past,
yes.
Certainly. Yes.
What was interesting to me on top of all this was that I found it difficult to place you as an author and your allegiances, which I think is a very good thing, because I think you were very open and simply interested in psychology as a whole.
Yes.
That seems to be
to me,
how it is for you.
Yeah, to me, it's the balance in psychology. It's the fact that psychology can draw on multiple perspectives that makes it strong, that makes it valuable. I mean, any one perspective can explain something about human behaviour, but there is also other things about human beings, or the mind, or whatever, that it won't explain. So it's only when you start to bring together multiple perspectives that you get a more rounded picture of the human being. because we're so complex. I mean, we have the neurological aspects of things, and when you start looking into neurology and the recent scanning stuff, there's fascinating stuff there, hidden in medical jargon, like the fact that the part of your brain that listens to music is also, while you're listening to music, strongly linked with the part of your brain that's to do with movement, and that's why we dance. People automatically move to music if it's the right kind of music. And the fact that it's actually there in the neural connections of your brain is fascinating. But it doesn't explain everything about dance. It doesn't explain the cultural symbolism of dance. It doesn't explain why you might go and watch a dance performance or anything like that. So there are several levels of explanation. And different schools of psychology have been able to deal with different levels. But it's only by bringing lots of it together that you get a properly rounded picture. That's the way I see it. And I think having multiple perspectives is our strength, not our weakness. I mean, this book is not a conventional history of psychology in the sense that most of the papers on history of psychology deal with who was on what committee and who founded what journal, and they're very, very dull, if you ask me. But this is a history of ideas. It's how ideas have emerged throughout psychology. And one of the things that's really evident to me is that psychology has never been a single unit discipline, ever. We always started from multiple viewpoints, and we've continued that way. But there's also sleeper effects as well. We've had ideas that have come up quite a lot of the time. Some of the ideas that are transformative in psychology actually were put forward 30 or 40 years before, but they didn't get... Okay, the publishers didn't like me using a phrase which is a very, very favourite of mine, which is that it's steam engines when it's steam engine time. You know this phrase?
Yes.
Thank you, because they didn't. They thought, nobody will understand that. But, the idea that the Romans had little steam engines, but they didn't use them. It wasn't until the social and economic aspects of society were there that we developed steam engines and started using them. So you need the right zeitgeist, you need the right time. And that's the same with these ideas. You had Adler with his individual psychology putting forward ideas in the 1930s, which really came into their strength in the 1980s, when we had a much more awareness of individuality and the individual person. And the great psychotherapists like Aaron Beck, who developed theories at that time, admitted that Alfred Adler had been one of their stimulating influences. So that's how it works. You get ideas coming up, and then they really hit the discipline later when it's the right time. I think that's true in all of them, actually. I mean, Wegener proposed continental drift, didn't he, about 30 years before the geological community accepted it. I think that's true. It takes time.
Steam engine time.
Engine time. Thank you.
Thank you. A final question is about what people might do with this book. And It's my definite belief that there's future professors of psychology who will pick up this book as our first introduction to the craft.
It's possible. It's possible. I mean, I certainly think it's certainly a book for the curious. If you're interested in psychology, but you don't know much about it, well, it's a book which will tell you something about it, and you'll get a more rounded perspective. I have spoken to some psychologists who teach history of psychology, and they're going to start using it as a set text, which is not what it was written for. But because it gives this rounded view, and because it gallops through the ideas rather than giving them a lot of detail about committees and journals and things, they like it. And I think people who are just interested in history probably like it. I mean, you can tell me more about that, But I think it's that's the great thing about writing for this Yale series, because you get people who just have an interest who will be picking it up. But I think you're right. I hope it does. I hope it does stimulate professors of the future, because I think psychology is a really fascinating subject, and I hope that gets across.
No doubt about it. I'm sure it will. In essence, what would you like a future professor to take from this book, to come away from this book with a certain idea in their minds about psychology?
First, not to try to force psychology into one single box, because it doesn't. That's not how it works. It works by our ability to solve problems, our ability to help people is precisely because we can draw from lots of different boxes. Because one of the things we're trained as psychologists is to be able to look at things from more than one perspective, to be able to see how many different factors have combined to produce this effect, and to get away from the sort of idea of a single answer. So I think that's that. I think a future professor, I'm hoping that eventually we'll be able to get more recognition of what Germán Gutiérrez called integrative psychology, where we can bring together things and have academic recognition for them, because at the moment you only get academic recognition for being terribly, terribly focused and specialised. And I think there is value. I hope a future professor will be able to recognise the value of being able to integrate, and I hope that this book would contribute something towards that. Other than that, any future professor of psychology, I think, is going to have to be aware that the world is a complex and very disparate place, and that psychologists have understandings of some processes and mechanisms that underlie things. But I mean, we've all got, for instance, social identification, them and us, is very much built into how we see the world. And we have social identity theory, which is as much of a theory as Darwin's theory of evolution, in the sense that it's nothing tentative about it. We know how it works. But you go and apply that in Hong Kong or Malaysia, and you get a different kind of outcome, because the process of social identification is different. No, sorry, the underlying process mechanisms are the same, but the way in which social influences are experienced is different, because those cultures have a different kind of emphasis. So we're very good at understanding the underlying mechanisms, but we also are now very much beginning to recognise the way that people are different in all sorts of different places. Of course we are. We construct our reality and we grow up in different cultures. I mean, how could we be this? If we were all the same, that would be really frightening, I think. So a future professor has quite a tightrope to walk really, between integration and diversification. But I think they can manage it, I think.
Well, this book is a start on that road, for sure.
I hope
a very
so.
good start. So thank you very much for talking to us, Professor Nicky Hayes, about your new book.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.